and then this narrative of suicide as well, because there's this whole thing of the dominant narrative now is that if you have gender dysphoria and you don't transition, then you're at an extremely high risk of suicide. Like, it's basically between transitioning and offing yourself.
And if
So
you have if you're a parent, the binary choice is, would you rather have a trans kid or a dead kid? And
exactly,
it's so profoundly challenging and somewhat manipulative. And what's a parent going to say? End of discussion, no dialogue. Parents that are grieving and thinking, oh, what's wrong with my child? How can I love them? How can I help them? Is this the right thing? All the questions of possibly grieving the loss of a son or a daughter in terms of the gender identity. But then it's like, that's the only decision, the only choice that you're given. You better do this and conform or your kid might be dead. And it's just like, that's just so stark, and no other options really.
It's so manipulative, and it's just so insane that it's doctors telling parents this. Because when I was a teenager and I struggled with anorexia, I had like a really serious case of anorexia. I had to be hospitalized, put in inpatient treatment multiple times. And, there was times that I threatened I was going to kill myself, like I said, if you don't let me starve myself, essentially, I'm going to kill myself. And the way that my parents and doctors responded to me at that time was to put me in a psych ward. Like, I was literally in a psych ward on 2 separate occasions because of that. And so it's just, I'm just laughing because, like, the ridiculousness of suddenly, because it's gender dysphoria, we should just give the kid whatever they want or they're going to kill themselves. Like, it's not how we've ever responded to suicide for like any other condition. And it's just so unprofessional, and it is manipulative. And the science that this is based off is or rather based on is really it's very shoddy. It's not the same quality of medical science that we would normally it's not equivalent to any other field of medicine in terms of the quality of science. So it's just and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, kids are hearing like, oh, if I don't transition, I could kill myself, and that is going to make them more likely to feel that way.
The concept gender affirming care. So gender affirming care in today's language is you affirm whatever is in the patient's mind, whatever is in their head, you affirm that, escaping the scientific reality that you have 2 X chromosomes. And why can't we have gender affirming care to work with people like yourself that are struggling with gender dysphoria, to affirm your femininity, to affirm your singing voice? I understand you have this problem, and we're here for you. We're going to affirm who you are for you to overcome these issues and be all you can be and maintain your assigned gender at birth. Maybe I'm looking at it wrong, so please correct me if I'm not seeing that correctly.
No, I think the term gender affirming care is absolutely misleading. You're right about that. I mean, even if you're someone who believes, there are some people who are truly trans. I myself, I'll touch on that in a little bit, but even if you are someone who believes that there are some people who are truly trans and should transition as adults or whatever, it's like, when there's one path that leads to lifelong medicalization, being reliant on big pharma for the rest of your life, and being permanently sterilized, having all these health issues, both known and unknown. When one path leads to that, and the other path leads to fewer doctor's appointments, and no medicalization, I think it's pretty obvious, like, which path would be the first choice. But this gender ideology tries to tell kids, like, oh, it doesn't matter whether you identify as your birth sex or the opposite sex. Like, they're both equally fine. And so if you just say you're the opposite sex, we should affirm you in that. And the problem with affirmation and like social transition is you know, most most often that will lead to the medicalization eventually, because I mean, social transition, if you're not like I attempted to socially transition, and it only made me feel more uncomfortable in my body, because it just made it more and more clear that I was not a boy, I was not a man, and I almost felt more compelled to start the medicalization. So yeah, I absolutely think gender. I mean, I just don't even like the phrase gender affirming care, because I think it's like I don't know if you've read 1984, but it's like new speak. It just doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean, and it's a nonsensical phrase. I think that what we need to be teaching kids is, no matter what kind of body you have, you're free to be yourself in that body.
2 + 2 is 5.
Exactly. Trans women are women.
What advice would you give to parents that have a child that is struggling with gender dysphoria or looking to possibly change their gender presentation, that are feeling uncomfortable? What can they do? What should they do? What shouldn't they do? What would your advice be for them?
So, disclaimer, I'm not a parent. Although I do feel kind of, I feel like a big sister towards a lot of these trans kids. You know, I have a lot a lot of empathy for them. And but yeah, as parents, I would say the number one most important thing is compassion and listening, just listening to your kid. You know, and just maybe asking more exploratory questions, you know, like, what is it about being a girl? Or you know, what do you think being a girl is? What is, how do you see being a girl? What about that is, you know, making you uncomfortable? Um, because, you know, that's one thing that I wish, you know, I love my parents. I'm so grateful for my parents, but um, you know, I didn't really feel like they listened to me around this issue. And so, you know, that's one thing I would say. I would say, but also, you know, it's hold firm to your beliefs. You know, this whole narrative of the suicide and all of that, you know, this isn't based in reality. It's not based in science. And so you can extend a compassionate ear without actually having to agree with this ideology. I'd also recommend the book Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier was really good. Material Girls by Kathleen Stock was really good as well. So I'd say educate yourself about the issue for sure. Try to monitor your kids' social media as well as much as you can, because even more so than when I was a kid, there are a lot of things out there that are just very toxic that I would not want my kid seeing, because it's very dangerous for a developing mind.
If you look at some of the papers, it just seems like everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but overwhelmingly people are happy once they transition. But you're saying, you know, these papers are painting a narrative, and the reality, maybe it's just anecdotally, maybe you have evidence, but it seems like there's more and more, and it's accelerating, those who felt like they were pushed into transitioning and now have detransitioned, and they feel like it wasn't the best move for them. And so would you agree with that? Because it does seem like people want to paint the picture that it's the greatest thing once you transition.
The problem with a lot of studies looking at the long-term impacts of medically transitioning is that, well, one of the things that's wrong with them is they have a very, very high dropout rate. So essentially what that means is, let's say there's a study of 200 people who, you know, either started hormones, had surgeries, etc., and then they follow up with them after a particular interval. And what happens is that 20, 30, 40, a lot of times over 50% of the participants are dropping out of these studies. So, you know, if 50% of your study drop out, but then, you know, the 50% that are left all say, sure, I'm happy, you're ignoring what happened to half of the people you're studying. So, you know, there's a lot of fake statistics that get thrown around, like only 1% of people detransition, and things like that. But it's just the quality of the science is not sufficient to make claims like that. So it's not real science. It is propaganda. Another thing that is wrong with a lot of these studies is that the follow-up period is very, very short. So, it's like a year, 18 months, maybe 3 to 5 years at the most for the follow-up. And a lot of the health issues for people who have transitioned don't manifest until 5, 10, 15 years after transitioning, but they can be really, really serious. And so studies have shown that the worst outcomes of transition, or rather like the suicide risk, for instance, is the highest 10 or more years after the surgery. I think a lot of people have a honeymoon period with transitioning. I think that they are told it's going to help them and they go forward with it, and for a while they get what they want and they feel better. I mean, even me, I did feel better for a period. If you would have asked me a few months after starting to transition, I would have said that I'm happy. So there's just a lot of these problems with the methodologies of these studies. And I can't even say that it's an accident because it seems very calculated to me, just given how many of them there are and how many flaws there are with these studies. So, there is a lot of new research coming out this year that is starting to paint a more accurate picture. And I think the further we go, the more the science is going to catch up. So, and anecdotally, people may report, I am happy after transitioning, and I don't want to discount that. But that said, people, especially people who suffer from mental illness, are notoriously poor. They're notoriously unreliable narrators of their own story and their own mental health. I mean, for instance, like, when I had an eating disorder, for instance, I thought my eating disorder was making me happier. I thought losing weight was making me happier, but it's just, we don't really have the data to support this.
And my last question would be, what about a real earnest friend, a real earnest person that wants justice and wants the best for somebody, and they're trying to support their friend by saying, "You go for it, you go ahead and transition. I'm going to be here for you." What kind of advice would you give to a friend who really means well, but might actually be doing harm and creating some pressure? How can they support their friend short of just saying, "You go for it"?
Michael, it's so hard, especially in the current, political climate of affirmation only, because I mean, it is somewhat like a cult. If you don't go along with the ideology, you are written off as hateful rather than caring. Personally, like my friends who are still transitioning, I wish them the best, and I really do wish them happiness at the end of the day. But I think affirming and agreeing to use opposite sex pronouns for somebody, I think it does ultimately encourage them to make irreversible changes, to harm their health, etc. So, I would not recommend affirmation, but I would recommend just still letting that person know that you care about them as much as possible. I mean, if it's someone that you absolutely, you must keep in your life, like it's a little bit different. But sorry, I'm kind of drawing a blank here, but
No, that's great.
I think it's situational as well, because obviously, like I being someone who has personally been through transition and detransition, like it's a little different than someone who's not involved with the community, because I do know how easy it is for someone to just kind of write you off as hateful and transphobic when really you do have this person's best interest at heart.